All right. And we're live and we hit the transition button. Hello, welcome to Derps Talk About Games. I'm your co-host, Mango.
And I am your co-host, Buddy.
And today we're going to talk a little bit about the sum of all parts. But before we do that, Buddy, why don't you show the folks know what it is we do on this podcast?
On this podcast, we talk about games. And today, I guess this is kind of like a more theoretical discussion. And this is my podcast topic, so I'm going to introduce it to everybody. But essentially, the question that I'm interested in, right? If games are kind of created as if games are kind of created as a piecemeal product, right? Which is to say that, we work on individual parts of our games slowly, and then they all come together into something that kind of coalesces, right? Um when does that work and when does that not work? And I have a couple of different sort of like veins of attack, right? Like different ways to kind of come at this. One of which is sort of the straightforward example of World of Warcraft Classic, right? I've kind of alluded to this in the past. Another one is sort of the action button reviews, sort of the way that Tim Rogers in the action button reviews will talk about how different games kind of come together into a good game or fail to and sort of coalesce into a bad game. I have other sort of thoughts about this when it actually comes to non-game stuff, just as a point of contrast, right? Like, for instance, why do we not think about things in these sorts of terms the same way in games that we do with like movies or television, for instance? Um, and I think all of that is, I don't know, all of that is interesting, and it's sort of like today's discussion. Where do you want to like start, I guess?
Um, well, why don't we start? So we got a request specifically in one of our personal chats
Sure.
about Wrath of the Lich King,
Okay.
and whether or not we're playing Wrath of the Lich King. I'm not. It's like a quick answer to the question. Maybe you answer that, and then you said you had a lens to analyze this topic through that. So
Yeah,
maybe
so
start
I
there.
have been playing a tiny bit of Wrath of the Lich King, which is to say that, I have my classic character. I've been running around, like doing stuff on the Wrath servers. But I don't have any, like I have no ambition to like clear heroic raids or anything kind of along those lines. But the lens of which that Wrath of the Lich King is really giving me is sort of that there does exist sort of sweet spots, right? So for instance, something that's really interesting about Wrath is that it is kind of the first time that spec and like class design really kind of coalesce for the different classes that are in World of Warcraft, right? At the time of Wrath of the Lich King, that number is 10. Warrior, Death Knight, Paladin, Shaman, Hunter, Rogue, Druid, um, Priest, Warlock, Mage, right? Those are the 10 classes, right? Each of those having 3 specs gives us 30 specs in the game. Um, the thing that's interesting about Wrath Classic is that there's real careful, sort of attention being paid to what makes a rotation, right? What are the abilities that you're using most often? What are your cooldowns look like, right? Like what are the stats that you're specifically looking for? And I would say that Wrath is a sort of first draft at some of this stuff, right? Like, so for instance, if we were to look at the numbers, Breath is pretty horrifically unbalanced you know, in terms of where damage is coming from, just because like designers didn't have a great sense for tuning at that time, right? They had created powerful rotations that were satisfying to sort of play through, but they were unable, I guess, to sort of keep those things in line, right? Which is why when we're going to see some of these bosses go down, certain specs in the game that are projected to be just like these absolutely insane heavy hitters, like assassination rogue is one that's given this sort of title, as well as like retribution paladin, right? um those pieces of fine tuning are missing, but the building blocks are kind of there for the first time, right? One of the reasons that I bounced off of Burning Crusade Classic when I tried to play Burning Crusade was because I felt like class design wasn't quite there yet, right? Like I didn't really have a rotation. The revamp of the talents that kind of happened didn't give me a real sort of play style or something to kind of look into, right? But now that I'm playing under Wrath, I have excuse me, I have new talents that have given me a much clearer, more straightforward rotation where it's like, oh, my build, you're like my spec is about applying rend, using rend to trigger overpower, and then using mortal strike when I have the rage, right? Which actually looks pretty common, looks pretty similar to what I have going in retail WoW, right? But Wrath is also the high point, like not only in terms of World of Warcraft subscriptions, right? Like we know that WoW was at its very peak with Wrath and has been on a decline ever since. With just sort of like, a new expansion will come out, they'll get 10 million players and then it'll drop, and then they'll get whatever, 8 million players and then it'll drop, that kind of a thing. Um, and we also have some information just from like former game employees where they talk about how systems that were good and interesting and fun in Wrath of the Lich King were denigrated later on in WoW's life cycle, right? So, for instance, Ghostcrawler, the former game director for World of Warcraft, has talked about how the redesign, like how heroic dungeons were an easy thing to get people to do in Wrath. People liked doing heroic dungeons, right? However, they complained about how easy the heroic dungeons were, and they also complained about the type of gear that they got out of these dungeons, right? Which is to say, badge gear, right? Being able to go to a vendor, you do the dungeon, you get some badges, you go to a vendor, and eventually you buy a high level piece of gear that's pretty desirable off of that vendor. They made changes in the next subsequent expansions, being um, Warlords of Draenor, Mists of Pandaria, and Cataclysm, and they were never able to get people to go into heroics that way again. Right? They essentially sort of killed heroics by answering sort of the feedback around heroics, right? Uh, and I think that some of that is sort of like interesting. Like, what are the pieces of the game that What are the pieces of the game that worked well? Oh, I'm sorry. And then another piece of this, which is just to say that those individual badge, like those badge vendors at the time were sort of denigrated as by members of the community as sort of like welfare gear, right? When it was sort of viewed as bad luck protection, right? Badge vendors basically had good items, right? Desirable items on them, and any boss you killed would drop badges for you, and you would go take those and you would turn them in. And so like maybe after 2 or 3 weeks of raiding, right, you would maybe walk away with a piece of badge gear for a slot that was really hard for you to attain, right? Or something kind of along those lines. uh this was like I said, people got really up in arms about this, and part of that is this feeling of building towards a thing is less satisfying than the surprise factor, right? Which is something else that we've talked about on the podcast before, right? People want to be surprised on Christmas morning. They want to open up a thing and see something cool that surprises them, because that heightens sort of the excitement of that moment. And in the same way, they want to see their gear drop from bosses so they can go, oh, what, oh, wow, right? Or whatever. Whereas when you make something a long, slow grind to build up to sort of, you know, take that probability, spread it out over the number of days, and incrementally let somebody build their way up to 100% probability that they get the item, all of a sudden that's not satisfying, right? Because it is viewed as a grind, it is viewed as mandatory, and if you haven't done it yet, it is just like, ugh, another gate that I have to sort of pass through in order to access some sort of fabled identity of the real game. Uh this has now sort of wound all the way back. Whereas in modern, like in retail World of Warcraft, in modern World of Warcraft, players are asking for a return to the the days of badge vendors, right? Where you will where different like developers will talk about the ways that gear is dropping, why, why gear is dropping the way that it is when it's coming out, whatever. um and players will just say, just bring badge vendors, it's that easy, right? Well, it's probably not that easy, I guess. And so all of this kind of is what's interesting to me, because it is the idea of taking a game and you're not looking at like the big picture, you're not looking at the full, you know the holistic product. You're looking at these individual systems to sort of like tweak and change. But when how many of those systems tweaking and changing yields a worse holistic product, right? Versus the opposite end of the spectrum, how do some of those individual systems working in in congruence with one another yield a really good strong holistic project, right? A lot of people would say that Wrath of the Lich King was their favorite version of World of Warcraft, and we can presume that a lot of that had to do with the coalescence of class design, the way that they had access to certain pieces of gear, the way that the game was starting to develop boss encounters to be more mechanically interesting and test players harder, right? I don't know. I feel like I've been talking for like 10 minutes. Am I in the ballpark? Is any of this making sense to you?
No, I mean it absolutely makes sense, right? Like how do constituent parts make up a whole? And where are those breakpoints? And like like how far does bending any one part particularly screw up a whole thing? And how like I don't know. I feel like so just to kind of like set a little bit more of the scene. Something else you brought up is that in Tim Rogers' most recent two action button reviews, um, with Boku no Natsuyama or something like that, Natsuyaki,
Well,
um,
so Yasumi, I think it is.
yeah,
Yasumi is the word for break.
for as he sarcastically calls it, my summer break. If you were to English dub it, from a couple weeks ago, and the Cyberpunk 2077 review from like 9 months ago. He talks about how like Bozo no not how my summer break basically comes to like it as a whole does a good job of evoking the summer spirit of being a child in the Japanese countryside, regardless of if you've experienced that particular life thing or not. Versus Cyberpunk 2077, where one of his chief criticisms of the game was that um, it kind of like a disparate set of systems that don't really coalesce into a good holistic game. Um, Part of this for me is like with regards to WoW in particular, is that WoW has always felt like a game that wasn't trying to be. Are you scratching your nose with a clothespin?
Yeah, I did do that. I have a clothespin here. Yeah, say hello. Hello. That's a joke you'll only get if you watch the YouTube.
Or watch it live, but sorry.
That's true. Also, or watch it live. Yes.
um, but anyway, point being is that WoW always felt kind of like a game that was like designed to be or tried to be a less holistic or didn't care as much about being a holistic game, right? It has these like different modes of play that are all like fairly divorced from each other. Um, but no, but like thinking about it, right? Like the systems all kind of feed into each other and they are kind of sectioned off from each other, but it doesn't feel as. I mean, I think part of it is that like WoW feels like a game that's like built on top, like kind of like lampshades its own artifice as a game, even though like theoretically it's not. Whereas Cyberpunk doesn't want to lampshade its artifice as a game as much, and so like you're less forgiving of it. But I don't know. I think the reason that I think you could probably put the same system in both WoW and Cyberpunk, and it would work. It would make WoW feel less, or it would feel Cyberpunk would feel less holistically together than WoW would because of this kind of like expectation of different modes of play in WoW. Whereas like Cyberpunk feels like you're kind of playing like several different games that don't quite all hit the mark. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, I think part of this is the word that I think is useful here is evocative, right? This is something I think about like in a professional context a lot, which is to say that the point at the end of the day, the point of video games, and I would probably extend this out to the point of art in general, but let's just keep it contained for now. The point of video games is to be evocative, right? It is about giving you the sensation in, like, let's say World of Warcraft terms, of being a raging berserker, right? Like as a fury warrior, right? Or as a dastardly underhanded duelist, for instance, if you are an outlaw rogue, right? Or as a you know I don't know, like a spell slinging, like a spell slinging blaster kind of caster, right? Which would be like fire mage or something like that, right? Like the different, all of these pieces of any of these different classes are built to come together, including not just the classes themselves, right? Like not just the individual class design of like, okay, well, if I, like if I'm a demonology warlock versus an affliction warlock, an affliction warlock puts a dot on a target, and the dot shows up as a debuff on their bar, and there's a little animation, and you watch like, you watch them sort of glow with shadow or something like that, or like they're on fire or something like that, right? Versus a demonology warlock who is going to summon a pair of two demons to go, fight and attack, right? Those two things could do the exact same amount of damage. Like the numbers on those could be the same amount of damage. The dot and the dogs could represent the same total damage over time as one another, right? But part of the evocative nature of being a master summoner who is summoning powerful demons on the fly, and being a, like a hexing curse, who drains the life out of my opponents by cursing them and watching them slowly wither under the effect of my spells. Like those are two evocative experiences that are created by, the art, right, and the writing of how the tooltips are written to talk about, right, like what these things, even just the icon, right, like the icon of a charging demon being different than the icon of a skull that is withering under purple, rot or whatever the sort of case may be, right? And this also goes into, like the world around it, right? Like, part of being a master summoner is having cool and interesting opponents for me to attack, right? Whether that is, dragons, or the, like animated husks that are the mossworn, or, dreadlords, or whatever, like whatever enemies and whatever reasons that the quest design team can create for you to fight those enemies. At the end of the day, all of those things are built to create the evocative experience of, stepping out of your regular mundane life and into essentially the world of Warcraft, right? One of the things that I have famously said is that nobody would play a version of World of Warcraft that was the exact same, except you got rid of all of the flavor, right?
Yeah.
If it was just stick figure, like different colored stick figures hitting ability 1, ability 2, and ability 3, like that, nobody would play that. Nobody's interested in that. But the ways in which that breaks down on like an individual level are very different, right? Because like people have all of these other ancillary sort of needs, right? At the end of the day, most people are going to choose a class that is based on, right, like something that, like some play pattern that appeals to them. But there are also going to be people who choose a class because it's numbers, right? Because they want to be the top of the DPS charts. This thing is meta. It feels good to be doing the most damage, and so they are going to swap, right, to in order to like min max their whatever, right? For these people, the game is still evocative, and it is evocative in sort of like a different way, but it's like evocative in the same way that like maybe a sport is evocative, right? Which is to say that like you are part of a team, you are participating in a competition, right, and you want to perform at your highest level. And so like that's the kind of thing that you're sort of going for, and all of these different pieces have to come in to create that evocative, like that evocative whole. And I think that's what Tim Rogers praises about Boku no Natsuyasumi, because, like taking the summer off, taking August off to go to the Inaka, which is the, the like rural Japan essentially. um Especially when you're a city kid, especially when you're like in Tokyo, like you live your life in Tokyo. That is a specific thing that you can design systems around, perfectly evoking, right? Or even to use a third game and muddy this metaphor and make it even more complicated, right? When I'm playing something like Total War, or something like Europa Universalis or Stellaris, the different mechanics of those games are also built to create the evocative nature of whatever it is, that I'm working towards, right? So for instance, in Europa Universalis, when I'm playing Spain has a very colonization focused, essentially like idea tree. This is like tech trees, but for individual like nations, where, the point of playing Spain is to be a conquistador, basically, right? And go, you're going to discover the new world, you are going to colonize it, you are going to, create these huge, wide-reaching colonies that are funneling wealth back into Spain, right? Versus if you're playing um, somewhere in the HRE, right, the Holy Roman Empire, it is much more about the internal politics of the Holy Roman Empire, where you want to become the Holy Roman Emperor. You want to wield the weight of this massive conglomerate of disparate states in order to exact, political power on a massive scale. Whether that's as Austria or as Brandenburg or as whatever other kind of component part, right? Um, and I just think that all of this is interesting. And yeah, I see Luke came in the chat, says I came in mid metaphor and I have no idea what's going on. We went from WoW to stick figures to roll Japan to being Spain. Now, really the point at the end of the day is that I think the point of games is to be, is to create this evocative feeling, whether that is making you feel like a powerful general in the Warhammer universe, whether that's giving you the feeling of conquering the new world as Spain, whether that is giving you the feeling of being, whatever, an unkillable war machine as a protection warrior in World of Warcraft, or whether or not the feeling is being a 9-year-old Japanese boy from Tokyo going out to visit his aunt and uncle in the Inaka in Boku no Natsu Yasumi. And I think the major failing of certain games like Cyberpunk 2077 is that individual components work against that overall sort of evocation, right? Um, which
Yeah,
sort of harkens back to the goblin thing that we were talking about a couple casts ago.
yeah. I think that that makes sense though, right? Because like I like Cyberpunk a fair about amount, but it feels like a really ambitious video game more than a Cyberpunk experience, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and there are other games in this genre that I think do cyberpunk much more with much less, if that makes sense. So for instance, I would also classify something like Skyrim as, sort of an open world RPG experience
Sure.
with all these side quests or whatever. And I think that the Skyrim experience is much more sort of evocative. I like to this day, I can just immediately just fall away into Skyrim in a way that I was never able to achieve with Cyberpunk, right? Um, and there's something about that, right? Like there's something about the magic of Skyrim, or Fallout New Vegas would be another example that I think people would use from kind of that classic time. Um, you would maybe call other Fallout games, right? Like people would maybe argue. I
Or
wouldn't.
Oblivion.
But other people, yeah, or yeah, like Oblivion, Fallout 3, Fallout 4. Maybe you would think of the 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 Mordor Shadow of War games, right? Like those are these like open world sort of fantasy experiences, right?
I
Like
I, I
all of these.
I actually think that's a good example because I feel like Shadow of Mordor did a better job than Shadow of War. Because I feel
Yeah,
like Shadow of War like fell into like the two gamey trap. Um
yeah. To be clear, I'm not calling Skyrim cyberpunk. I'm really talking about like sort of this genre of games, right? Whether it is cyberpunk, whether it is fantasy,
yeah,
whether
like
whatever else.
open world RPG, right? Because
Yeah,
like you know, actually, this may be a good example, right? Like, God of War Ragnarok versus like Assassin's Creed Valhalla. Like Valhalla feels like a game more than it feels like. I think part of that's also the framing device, right? It keeps kicking you out to do the meta plot stuff, which is fine, I guess. But like, it also cuts against the ability for it to feel like you're a raging warrior because you're not. You're supposed to be a, I guess, young woman who is playing the memories of this Viking warrior.
to be honest, I don't really super remember.
But I
I
think that's
played a
part of the
lot of Valhalla
problem.
and I like it, but I don't remember what the framing device was if it
Well,
was.
I think that's part of the problem, right? Like, there's not enough stress on the framing device to make you feel like you're actually part of the framing device. It feels like a thing that's happening. But to me, it also feels like because that conceit is used to justify so many like like it is used as a diegetic way to justify the game mechanics, right? Like it feels like a game because like all those things that like maybe you can like it feels like it tries to be too clever by half, I think. Whereas God of War Ragnarok, it has a lot of interface elements, but you're supposed to be playing as Kratos, and that works, right? Like it feels like you are playing the God of War, um, in that way. Whereas I think you get a lot of that, like you get a lot of that feeling with Valhalla, but it still feels like you're playing a game about that, which is like a weird kind of distinction to make. But I think that's important for kind of like making games super memorable and making them super, um, you know, making them super impactful. Maybe this is like I think a point in kind of the games of sports versus games as art talk that we have a bunch is like I don't think Call of Duty's fairly
Same.
very good at being evocative, right? Like
Yeah.
I love playing Call of Duty though, right? Like I played the beta uh a couple weeks ago. I might buy this year's version of it, but I'm not buying that game to feel like, a modern soldier on the battlefield, right? I'm playing that game because I want to like shoot people and hear sweet guitar riffs when I level up my AK-47 and put like a gold skin on it, right? Like that is totally divorced from anything. And like I don't think it's like, man, I saw, I don't, I don't remember the context for this, but I saw something somewhere. Maybe it was like the title of a video I didn't watch. That was like Battle Pass. No, it was the title of an extra punctuation that I didn't read. That like Battle Passes keep games from being art, essentially. Right? That there's no live service game that can function as art, which I don't think is a take I agree with. But I haven't. This is from Yahtzee. I didn't read the whole
Mm.
thing, so or I didn't read the thing at all. I just read the headline, so I can't address his argument properly.
But I
Um,
think I do. I think I can immediately understand where it's going because I understand this nature, and I do think that this is part of the conversation when it comes to stuff like. I mean, obviously for me, it's like WoW, right? But so for instance, in WoW, there's this kind of colloquialization that was created by I actually believe an old item designer from the game named Jeff Hamilton, um, who talked about the WoW being two games, right? One game is sort of a Dungeons and Dragons simulator, essentially, right? It is you and a bunch of your friends. You're going to get together. You are going to go into a dungeon, a raid, and you are going to fight like a boss with neat mechanics until you get the loot, right? And the point of that game is to kill the dragon, loot the dragon's hoard, right, and feel like like a conquering adventurer, right? And how that's cool and how that's interesting. Another part of like that's game one. Game two is I am going to show up to practice essentially. I am going to work out and try really hard in this athletic team environment, essentially this sports team environment, and here is an external stats keeping website that is going to track my progress measured against everyone else's of my position on the team. And I'm going to be able to brag about how good I am in the same way that a baseball player, in the same way that Alex Rodriguez, I guess before he took steroids, would have been able to say, I am a fantastic baseball player over someone who is just a mediocre baseball player, right? Those are two games that simultaneously like live on top of one another in World of Warcraft rating, right? Like you could look at rating through both of those sorts of perspectives, and in many ways, right, like that second perspective has gained a lot of power and force in recent years, right? The biggest World of Warcraft screamer after Asmongold is Limit Max, right? Who is basically the number one, esport guy in the world, right? Not to mention all the other different ways that like you have the Arena World Champions, you have Mythic Plus, the Great Push, you have the MDI, the Mythic Dungeon Invitational, all that stuff that is also sort of like esportsifying World of Warcraft. You also have people on the opposite end of the spectrum, right? People who are just there to hang out, they're interested in the lore, right? YouTubers who are interested in the lore, Talianus and Evotel or whoever else, who you role players, right, like that kind of stuff, who are mostly interested in game one, right? They are on board for the game one version of that, like of that sort of experience, and I think this is maybe the diffusion of that games as art, games as sport dichotomy, because at the end of the day, WoW is both at the exact same time, which is kind of nuts to think about. Do you know what I mean? Like,
yeah, no, it's interesting because like we when we do our derpies every year, We have for the past couple of years done games as sport, games as art, best game of the
Hmm.
year, and sometimes that best game of the year is the best synthesis of those two elements. But like WoW, I think wants to hold them separate from each other at a certain level, which is interesting, and it still works, right? Like you said, because like game one and game two are very separate experiences within World of Warcraft, whereas something like I would say God of War Ragnarok, right? Like that game does both as one, right? Like it is there for the is there for for that synthesis moment and trying to seamlessly meld the two together. At
Yeah.
least for the most
Like, I
part.
think on one end, you might have something like Rocket League, which is pretty truly games as sport.
Or yeah.
It's maybe the most game as sport I can think of off the top of my head, outside of just true sports simulators like FIFA or whatever. Even those, I would actually think I would argue are probably more evocative than like in a games as art sense, because like it's like a lot of the times those games are trying to give you the feeling of like managing this sports team in and of itself, and like like that
Yeah,
at that
you're
point
supposed to
it's
be
almost like
the sports people, right? Like you can see
yeah, yeah,
this
yeah.
in like the fantasy elements that don't need to be there, which is like penalties, right? There's no reason in a simulation where you need to ever have a penalty. You just keep people from doing things that are illegal, right? But
Yeah,
they
and
reintroduce that stuff.
those games will almost always have this overarching framing device of like you are a coach of your team, right? Which is like that has more in common with like a sports movie than it does with like a sports broadcast, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
Um,
to your point, no one plays like football simulator devoid of the team markings. Everybody plays Madden because that's the one that has the NFL license, right? Like
Yeah, and nobody plays a version of Madden where all you are doing is playing one player on the field, right? You are playing the version of Madden which is very pulled back, and you can change between the different players.
mm,
You're setting the plays, you're doing all the stuff that the coach would be doing, right? Whereas whatever the case may be, this is sort of off topic. My point is that Rocket League is actually, I think, a better game as sport than games based on traditional sports, right? So that's one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum, you might have something like Mutazione, right? Um, like Mutazione behind the frame. Mutazione probably more so than that. Mutazione is fundamentally an artistic experience. The thing that it is interested in doing is getting you to believe in this world, believe in these characters, follow their narrative through to its through line, right? Break that up every once in a while with like just some incredibly straightforward, not hard to complete. Like I would never in a million years say that it is a challenge for a player to solve the gardens. The gardens are there to, you know, provide something tactile for a player to do outside of just running around the town and talking at each of the individual dialogue boxes, right? Um, and the culmination of that is that the story comes to a narrative climax and ends, right? You play through all of the individual dialogue encounters, you follow all of the plots until they all get wrapped up in a climactic confrontation with whatever, and the story comes to an end, right? And there are games in the middle of those two things, like God of War, right? Which is simultaneously built to be something of a gameplay challenge, right? Like you're not supposed to just walk through God of War. Part of it is about hitting the buttons on the controllers in the correct ways to beat your opponents, obviously, right? But it is also about connecting to Kratos, connecting to whatever the stupid kid's name is. Um and
Atreus.
that father's it's Atreus, and that father son dynamic that the two of them have together, right? And then on the opposite, like in a weird way, it's like so that's a spectrum, and you have something in the middle, but it's not even a spectrum. It's I guess like a circle or something, because I would say WoW is on the opposite end of the spectrum from God of War because it is not a synthesis, but it is sort of like a uh it is that it is two in one, right? It is these two things simultaneously with the exact same mechanics, but they are disparate pieces of the puzzle, right? Because WoW can separate out LFR difficulty or normal difficulty from mythic difficulty, it has this ability to create a space for games as sports players and a space for games as arts players, and they cohabit that space, which is the World of Warcraft. But it is not a synthesis of those two things. It is not asking players to do both at once. it is generally speaking asking players to, you know, find exactly how much of a sport and how much of an art they want it to be, which is way more complicated. When we created this diaspora years ago, this is way more complicated
Yeah.
than we had ever expected it to become.
Yeah, no, this is also interesting because, like, I'm thinking, right? Like, you know, there's a certain definition of like a game as art that's like good at like conveying a kind of like deep and complex message, right? Like, I think you could say something like, say, like Dear Esther, any of these walking simulators that have like relatively minimal gameplay but tell compelling and interesting stories, do right. But then the other side of this, to your point, like, I think there's like a real thing to the art of evoking a particular thing, which I think hews less closely to that kind of like pure message story part, right? Like, there's like a like this is like, say, Skyrim versus say God of War Ragnarok, right?
Yeah.
Like, Skyrim is about making you feel like the fantasy hero, right? Um, and letting you like submerge yourself in that experience, and like it does that better than like God of War Ragnarok is about telling a good story about Kratos, whereas like, which is different than like, playing as, something like Dear Esther where you're like experiencing a particular specific story, which is different or like Gone Home, we're playing someone who has come home um to find an empty house, right? Versus, but it's like about telling that story environmentally versus something like Skyrim, which is about um, evoking what it's like to be that certain thing, which is what we've been talking about here, right?
Yeah.
And I think there's like, it's interesting because I think you can make like a pretty strong argument. I think that something like, um, so a game I've praised as art in the past has been The Return of the Obra Dinn, right? Um, and weirdly, I think that you could make it like you could make the case that that game is better at evoking the weirdness of being essentially an insurance claims investigator with a magic stopwatch, right? Like, than like certain story focused games are at like, evoking the experience of being their characters. Like the more derisive way to put this is like they're basically like movies, like vaguely interactive movies, right? Like, um, I don't know. I feel like I'm not getting myself across super well, but like there's like an art.
So something I think is interesting is part of how I think about, you know, art in general, media in general, is dividing it into these component parts, right? So, for instance, Aristotle in the Poetics, and this has always been my framework, divided theater in particular into six component parts in descending order of importance, right? It's plot, character, theme, setting, um, melody is what he uses here, and that's because he's musical, right? And then essentially spectacle, he uses a different word, but really the thing he's talking about is sort of surprise and spectacle, right? Like novelty, that kind of stuff, right? So for instance, you might say that something like um god, what was the movie that we just saw that was exactly like this? That Oh, Bullet Train. Bullet Train is a movie that is propped up by its plot, right? It is intricately plotted where all of these different, Swiss watch pieces are falling into place at just the right moments as to be satisfying, like narratively satisfying as a whole, right? Whereas something like uh John Wick, right? We would say on an like on an action filmmaking level, right? Or a world building level, John Wick is that's what makes that thing narratively satisfying, right? And you can have different like component pieces of the thing that make the thing good. Something like Mutazione, I would say Mutazione is a fantastic game, right? Like nominated for a million independent games festival awards, right? Um, lavished with praise from critics and fans or whatever. But like the thing that makes Mutazione good is that the plot and characters are like draw you in, right? You are playing Kai's story and you are sort of inhabiting her head, but you are meeting all of the different, characters in the ensemble of Mutazione, and they are I should use a better example for this than the one that my company made and that I personally shipped, but whatever. I'm a this is my privilege of making games. I get to use my own games as examples. But I think Skyrim, right? The art of Skyrim is all in the world building, right? It's in creating this setting that you can just sort of like fall into completely, where you know it is you are going from town to town and you are learning the different ways in which these towns work and what their problems are and how you can solve some of them, right? And you have Windhelm, which is the town of this guy who is doing this stuff, right? You can go do individual quest lines, like what are the mages up to, right? Like you can customize your character. The character in Mutazione is very straightforward and defined, in the same way that Kratos is, right? Which is this is a specific person who is doing specific things, right? There are really not that many choices in either, as far as I understand, God of War or Mutazione, as to how Kratos or Kai go through their individual experiences. They are, generally speaking, playing through an individualized narrative that plays out from beginning to end, right? Um, Skyrim is the opposite of that. Character basically doesn't exist in Skyrim because it is built to be projected upon. It is built as like the character in Skyrim is built as a means of expression of how you want to interface with this unique and compelling and interesting world, right? And I think all of that is like really interesting and compelling and tough to, I don't know, tough to parse, right? Like what are
Yeah,
the component pieces of all of that?
yeah. So this is interesting because you mentioned when you went on your thing about Aristotle, there's like the 8 types of fun, that like get brought up in like game design articles. And just to go over them quickly, there's sensation, which is like the physical aspects. I think when we talk about this, like usually this gets applied to tabletop games, and sensation is typically like pieces. But I think this would apply to things like Destiny feels good because it does like game recoil and sheen scrape. It makes the weapons feel weighty, even though there's like no difference in feedback on your mouse. I think that's kind of what sensation would be like in the video game context. There's fantasy, which I think is just like world building aspect. Narrative, I think it's pretty self explanatory. It's a story and whatnot. Challenge, fellowship, discovery, expression, and submission. Submission being kind of like this. Generally described as kind of like the grindiness aspect, like the enjoyable parts of grinding. Also, sometimes kind of like being part of the routine has its own
Well,
pleasure
this is
to it.
also this is the machine zone, right? That
Yeah,
we've talked about in other contexts. Yeah.
yeah, but like it's interesting because like I think you're absolutely right, but I also think that like you can like map some of these types of fun to specific like aspects of like our relatively binary scale of like art or sport, right? Like fantasy narrative to some extent, um, expression. Those are all like part of like the art aspect, um, where I think like like narrative and fantasy are like very solidly in that art aspect, versus like challenge and submission, um, are more part of like the challenge, especially part of the sport aspect. Sensation maybe is even part of that. Like sensation can kind of like go both ways. Like I think you could like
You can make
vaguely
an
like
argument, yeah.
yeah.
For instance, I actually think that you could probably make an argument on many of these for different, like. So the one I'm thinking of off the top of my head is Discovery. The If I am a game as sport player, right, there is a lot of fun in figuring out how this thing works, right? Like a world first raider figuring out, or actually maybe a better example of this is like Summoning Salt. When Summoning Salt is dissecting famous speed runs and unpacking kind of the world records, right? He is engaging with these games purely as sport, right? He really does not give a fuck about any of the sort of like artistic ends of what that game is going to look at, right? But the joy of that, and the joy of the speedrunners doing the thing that he is then summarizing in his YouTube videos, right, is in the discovery, is in figuring out this uncharted territory of, oh, well, if I use this crazy hack or this, interesting build, I can actually leapfrog someone else's records. I can beat someone else's records, before before they are able to do that, right? If I am a world first raider, I am interfacing with World of Warcraft purely as a sport at that point. So much so that we would call that esports, right? It is, for the time that world first rating exists, it is the dominant esport on the planet, right? You get hundreds of thousands of people who are watching these Twitch streams, and they do this, for 2 or 3 weeks, every 3 months or every 6 months, basically, right? Well, those people, as they are discovering what the World of War, like what the raid mechanics are, and they are figuring out strategies to bring to those raid mechanics. They are engaging with like discovery as fun, and I feel like I could go through each of these and do that exact same thing. Even something like narrative, right? Like I think that there's quite a lot to of power, right, to the narrative that gets created in sports environments, right? It's something that people talk about when it comes to esports all the time, is like the moment where someone has the bottom of the ninth home run, that creates a powerful narrative in that sports context entirely, that is fun and explosive and really interesting. And that's not artful at all, but it is like, does that make sense?
I don't know. I feel like you could. I think there's a strong argument to be made that like narrative and challenge are both kind of diametrically opposed. Like, if you've got like an axis that like cuts through this wheel of fun types, right? That challenge is on one end and narrative is on the other in terms of like art versus sport. Because I think that like what you're talking about, like that narrative aspect around baseball, that like talks about like reasons why sports documentaries and like sports games can have like compelling dramatic stakes, even though they're mostly sports things. But I think that's like the parts of that like approach art rather than being rather than being the parts of that are the sport. Like I think that's like a part of it that's separate from the sports part.
So to be clear, I'm not. I don't want to use like a sports documentary as the thing. It is just it shows an encapsulation of what is being experienced in the moment, right? Like when okay, when in TSM versus CLG at MLG Anaheim 2013, they had this insane back and forth where the players did a full, kill of the enemy team, right? And went all the way to the enemy nexus just in time for everyone to respawn, and then they got full. What did they call that? Aced. They and then they got fully aced, and then someone decided to backdoor the other nexus while the other team is fine, and then the nexus finally goes down. Everyone in that arena is caught up in the game as narrative, and the fun of the narrative and the game as sport at the same time. They're caught up in the drama of the moment, of this incredibly interesting, heart pounding match playing out before their eyes, right? That's fun, that's drama, that's tension, right? But it is entirely devoid of any kind of artistic kind of context. And when those players
I
on
think you're
that
wrong there.
stage,
I think you're wrong about it being devoid of artistic context. I think it's bringing in a little bit of artistic context to that. Because, like, if you saw the same thing play out between, like, two AI bots, I think you don't have that energy there. I think that's, like, the artistic version of, like, the artistic bit that makes sports compelling right? Like, no one watches two robots play chess against each other, right? They always watch chess for like a robot versus a human or two humans playing, right? And I think that's like the narrative. I think this is me basically saying that you can't have like a completely sport based thing because like the narrative hook is what pulls you in, and that's like part of the artistry of it, even if it's a relatively low art environment.
so interesting. So that I think I disagree with that fundamental predication, because I think that there do exist 100% games as sports, right? Like I would say that maybe League of Legends isn't a great example, but baseball, or like is
So the
football?
the games are like the actual games playing on the like the actual mechanics are, but like the match as a thing spectated by humans between two teams, I don't think is 100% sport, right? Like there is other stuff there, right?
Huh.
Like
Okay.
a football game that is red versus blue and just plays out, like something like what was the like the NES game, I forget the name of it, or like Blades of Steel is the hockey game, right? Like those have like theoretically the teams on it, but they're basically just colored things. That's like basically pure sport, right? But when I am in like the Rock, the Prudential Center in Newark, New Jersey, and I'm watching Devils face off against the Rangers, right? There is something additional and different there, because otherwise I could just like watch two computer players play, the Devils versus the Rangers, and that should be the same experience, but it's not, right? Like,
Okay, so I think that the match is a fundamental piece of the game construction. The game is entirely like theoretical, and it is fundamentally incomplete in the same way that a script is an incomplete version of movie if you do not have players playing the match, right? Like, and the principle is true whether or not you're in the Rock in Newark or whether you're at a little league game, right? Like my little league teams were named after, like, I was a member of the Bush team, and the Bush was a landscaping company that sponsored our team,
sure.
so we had the Bush, right? Like there's no, it's not even like we're the Tigers or the Bush Tiger. It's just like literally we were just the Bush. Um and there is still that level of narrative drama and tension to whether or not we win or lose our little league game, right? Like if I hit a grand slam in the bottom of the ninth in little league, it's fundamentally the same drama and tension and narrative as me hitting, if I were on the like me hitting a grand slam at the bottom of the ninth if I were on the Yankees. Does that make sense?
I don't think that's true. Like, I think, like, the difference there is, like, like, who cares, right? Like, if, let's say a high school buddy is on his high school baseball team, right?
Sure.
Like, you would have home run in the bottom of the ninth versus a Yankee that does it, right? Like, there's a fundamental difference there based on the fact that it's you versus, like, you as a high schooler versus you as a Yankee, and those have different, like, valences to them, right? Like, sometimes there is a big push there, right? Like, if you're, like, a rising talent and this high school thing makes a difference, or like your team's an underdog team or whatever. But that's all like part of the narrative around it, right? Because I don't think there's something like, I think if what you were saying was true, it was 100% sport, those would be in fact easily substitutable for each other or for any bottom of the ninth home run. But that's not true for like a number, like for reasons that are kind of like tied to like the small amount of artistry that does enter into these kinds of things.
Here's my fundamental thing. At the end of the day, whether or not I'm a Yankee, whether or not I'm in Little League, when I hit that home run, what kind of fun am I having? Part of the fun that I'm having is the drama, right? Is when the chips were on the line, I was able to hit the ball out of the park and get all three of my teammates around, around to home so we could score 4 runs and win the game or whatever that sort of like looks like, right? And insofar as we are asking the question, what are these different 8 kinds of fun, right? How do they map on our sort of template of games as art, games as sport? That is a moment where I am playing the game as a sport, and the kind of fun that I am having is narrative fun. Does that make sense?
It does, but I don't think that fun comes out of the sport aspect of it. Like,
Yeah, well, it does because the sport created the gameplay mechanics created that situation where a narrative sort of procedurally generated itself in a way, right? And I think this is why the computers thing, right? Like I understand your computer's point, but I sort of think it's missing the mark because a computer isn't capable of having fun, right? The point isn't to say that I, as an audience member, am watching the game play out, and that's where the fun is taking place, right? Like, yes, when I watch two computers play against one another, that's really not all that interesting, and I'm not on board with it. The point is that the actor, the player of the game, is the one who is experiencing the fun, and a computer isn't capable of experiencing fun, right? A computer can neither derive fun from game as challenge nor game as narrative, right? It's completely you immaterial to a computer because a computer can't experience fun, but a player can. And the kinds of fun that a player can have in a baseball game or in a chess match or in whatever else is both game as challenge and game as narrative fun at the same time, right? In baseball, I can have the fun of defeating the enemy team, which is a much better team. They have a better record, or maybe this pitcher is really good and he struck out the rest of my team or whatever, and I can overcome the challenge of his curveball. That's fun, right? But I can also have the narrative fun of, the drama and tension of the moment of whether or not I can score the game-winning
right?
home
No,
run,
no.
and I
I see what you're saying, but I think that's like mild amounts of game, like, of story as art, like, or of games as art entering the picture, right? I think that's like why you can make, like, that was my point about the documentary thing, right? Is you can make a documentary about those like moments because there's like an artful story to be told there, right? Um, Like
Couldn't you
there's
make a couldn't you make a documentary about that challenge though? Right? Or a documentary is a bad way to put this. Like a guide, right? If I create a guide for a puzzle game, aren't I also doing the same thing that the documentary is doing? Which is to say, I am making a sort of derivative work off of the thing itself. One of which focuses on the fun as narrative, like explaining the narrative and why that's enthralling to someone. One of which is in explaining the challenge to someone.
right, but the guide is not the guide is not there to like the guide is not a piece of work in itself, right? Like it's not capturing any of the narrative, and so it's only sold to people who are looking to mechanically master the game, right? Like if I have a deep appreciation for Tetris players, right? Like I might go watch, the World Tetris Championships even if I'm not good at playing the game. But like I don't read a Tetris guide if I'm not playing the game practically, right? Like like the only sense in which I could see myself reading a Tetris guide if I'm not a Tetris player is if I'm trying to understand a how a player plays the game, but that seems like a different thing to me, right?
That seems immaterial. Like what? Like to what extent does that matter? Right? They are both these derivative works that are explaining the different kinds of
Right,
essentially fun that are a component piece of the game
right,
itself.
but the documentary is not it, the documentary is not capturing or the documentary is capturing the narrative, right? The game guide is not like and like it's like again, fun. We've talked about this before. Like fun is like maybe an inexact word, but like the
Sure.
documentary is transferring that experience from someone who experienced it or someone who watched it to someone who has not. Right? It is a story that you can tell to someone else for their entertainment. Right? The guide is not there for entertainment. The guide is there for guidance. Right?
Matters though. I feel like what matters is one it is a derivative piece of media that explains the component part of the foundational piece of
But the
media.
documentary isn't just explaining, right? Like a documentary that just goes over what happened in the game is boring and nobody watches it, right?
Sure, but at the end of the day, that's what it is. Like it is taking that content, right, and it narratizes that, right? And you could make the case that a guide can also do that exact same thing, right? Like I could write a guide that is fun and interesting and compelling on that sort of level without necessarily having to like lean on narrative, right? A well-written champion spotlight is a guide, but it has a lot of personality, right? And it's fun,
Sure,
right?
that's fair. That's fair. I don't know.
We've gotten so I don't even know where the fuck we are.
Yeah,
We're
that's
like on
fair.
time on this. Like
Yeah, well, I thought we weren't gonna have enough time to deal with this, but yeah,
we thought we were gonna have enough time to like talk about this whole thing. I don't even really know like where I ended up with it or whatever. I really the thing I think about a lot is I think about that evocative nature of things. One of the parts of my job that's funny is reviewing titles. Right, when we get games that we are thinking about publishing, we review them. Different members of the team all sort of review them, and then we give a big piece of comprehensive feedback. And I'm very used to this sort of thing because of when I was working at a production studio, where because of where I was working at a production studio where I was doing script coverage, right? Where I was breaking, that the game down into these or for that it was a script into these kind of component parts in order to tell a producer whether or not I think it's a good or a bad idea to buy the option to this script, basically, right? Um, and the the question of evocation is always on my mind, right? Something that I had talked about before was how last week in the that donkey segment was how you know I see games at this alpha stage a lot, and Donkey does not properly demonstrate to me that he has the skill set, I guess is how I would say it, to like be an effective indie game publisher because you don't get the finished product. You don't get Undertale. You get a vertical slice that somebody made 3 years ago that hopefully will be will be evocative of what Undertale will eventually sort of look like. So I am thinking more and more in terms of those, in terms of being evocative these days, and how games kind of coalesce into holistic, products for individual people and kind of hit them in the right spot. And that's it. That's my thoughts.
no, that's totally fair. I think evocativeness is a very important part of making a game feel like a masterpiece in a lot of ways, right? Like I think the games that like stick with you are very evocative, and that's like a thing that we haven't really put our fingers on
Yeah.
in a lot of ways.
I think that actually underlines what I fundamentally disagree with Tim Rogers' sort of action button season 2 thesis statement, which is that games that are modern and coming out now are bad sort of, and like old games are good, right? I actually think that Boku no Natsuyasumi sounds worse than Mutazione, right? Or you could even make an argument that something like like Stardew Valley or something like along those lines, sort of an evolution of what Boku no Natsuyasumi is trying to sort of like get at. But the thing that Boku no Natsuyasumi does that attracts people is that holistic, like that it can sort of
Sure.
evoke that whole. And I think there are plenty of modern games. Obviously, God of War being a good example, right? I would probably mention some of what maybe like Far Cry would be a good example of this. Like some of those different Far Cry games that I've played, or like other, at the end of the day, modern experiences that are like ultimate, even like Mutazione, right? Mutazione is actually a pretty similar game, all things considered, to Boku no Natsuyasumi, in the sense that it is a you know it is a game where you have a finite amount of time to just sort of relax and immerse yourself in the characters of this like world, and you have little essential mini games to kind of go through, and that's like more or less it. That's what the game is all about, and what it is uh predicated on, right? And I think the story of Mutazione is deeper and more complex than what Boku no Natsuyasumi has to offer, at least from my understanding of it from Tim Rogers' exhaustive review.
Yeah, I mean,
um,
I feel like most or like a lot of Tim Rogers' review is like a reflection on nostalgia as like a
yeah,
topic, right? Like that's kind of like what he does with a lot of these things, kind of like reach some other point. Um, but I kind of want to like reflexively disagree with you on the fact that like Mutazione is not a better game at like portraying a Japanese August, right? Like, which is
okay, sure.
what Botsuyu Natsuaki is setting out to do, right? Like,
How many different ways can we pronounce it? You
yeah.
tell us, chat. God, put it in the comments.
But I think I'm generally with you that like I almost called him Aaron Rodgers. Tim Rogers is like the end of the cyberpunk review felt like he was kind of like getting a little too deep into kind of like boomer nostalgia territory, um, which I'm not a super big fan of. But I also don't think that
Yeah.
invalidates his other opinions. But so I'm always interested to see what he has to say about things. Because I found the back part of the Botsuyu no Natsuaki. I can't pronounce this, but the back end of that review where he basically goes into like how he like visited his childhood home in Kansas,
Kansas.
yeah, and how that like basically flooded him with like nostalgia and emotion in a way that he was having trouble processing. Um, I think that's like a valuable thing to interrogate and look at, right? Because I went back to our alma mater for our 10-year reunion. You were sorely missed, but like it I it was obviously not as deep because I had only been 10 years as opposed to like the 20 that Tim Rogers had spent away from his native Kansas. But like I felt a lot of that kind of like, huh, right? Like this was like a thing that I've lost that was there, and I don't know. It's an interesting thing to experience, and it's also like it kind of tie it back. It's an interesting thing that you could maybe capture in a video game, right? Like Boats No Yachts. This game captures the feeling of being a Japanese child in August, right? Like, which obviously would have a different value to me than it would to be like a Japanese businessman who had done that summer at some point, right? Like,
Did you ever, kid? Did you ever do? Obviously, the Inaka doesn't exist in the United States, right? But like, for instance, summer was always when my family would make two trips. We would either go to Cape Cod which is where my aunt and uncle live, and my cousin Nico lived, who's my age. And I would hang out with him in Cape Cod in Massachusetts, or we would go to South Carolina, where my aunt and uncle lived, and my cousin Zachary lived, and we would hang out. We would hang out in South Carolina, right? And like both of those were sort of like I. There is a lot of particulars, and by the way, I never went to the Inaka myself when I lived in Japan, but there are some pieces of that review that like fucked me up just from living in Tokyo. He describes this thing that of walking out of your air conditioned apartment into like the hot Tokyo uh summer, and then walking into an air conditioned train station and an air conditioned train so that you could go back into the Tokyo summer, so you could go into an air conditioned convenience store. And that is such a real feeling. It fucked me up because it's it's just so real of this like ping ponging in and out of air conditioning. That was when I was in the summer in Tokyo. What that was like, or like the feeling he had this thing of like walking out of a Tokyo convenience store, and you walk through this blast of air conditioning, right? And you just immediately get drenched in sweat. I'm just like that's so real. But whatever the case may be, right? Like I feel like the American version of that Inaka sort of summer does exist, and it kind of exists in that like, oh, I'm going to go visit my aunt and uncle in this other this dramatically different part of the country, that just functions on completely different rules than the place that I grew up functions on.
Yeah, no, like I think Tim Rogers mentions that like Americans don't have like an equivalent tradition. I'm like, I think they do. It's just kind of like varies by region, right?
Yeah.
Like for me, like I was fortunate enough that my grandparents had a shore house that we would go to fairly regularly down the Jersey Shore. But like our big trip for the year was for most of my childhood down to the Outer Banks, North Carolina. We'd rent like a room somewhere for the first handful of years, the same kind of like complex, and we'd go to the beach because that was close enough that we didn't have to fly, but far enough away that it was still exotic, and we could do a bunch of different things.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, and there's a lot of the one of the things that I think is really unique about that is the process of it, right? Like I have all of these memories about the process of driving to different locations. Like, so for instance, my grandparents on my dad's side live in Ithaca, New York, right? And the drive from Maplewood or Morristown, depending on where I was living at the time, from there to Ithaca is basically the same thing, right? It's you drive along Route 80, you drive up some of these other sorts of roads until eventually you get off on sort of these like backwood streets. And there are pieces of that drive that are etched into my memory in a way that are just like for instance the Tannersville Diner, which ironically is the town next to the town that my partner Rachel grew up in, right? Like so the like stopping at the Tannersville Diner because it's kind of halfway there is like a big thing, right? And getting spaghetti and meatballs at the Tannersville Diner, right? Or when we got off the highway and we started driving up through essentially sort of like country, like in-state, like highways that are not real highways, but they're like two lane roads driving through the country. There's this spot where if we went at a different, like depending on what time of year we would go at and like where things were, there either was or wasn't a huge beaver dam like off to the right side. And it was this thing of like, did the beavers make their dam, did they not make their dam, right? As like as we're like winding through, as we're sort of like winding through, and I can play vividly in my head like the the sight of it, like cresting over the hill, rounding down this sort of slope. The little pond where the beavers may or may not have made their dam is off to my right, and then you disappear into some forests, like going further or whatever. And I feel like I have a million memories that are like that, right? Like of these little individualized things that when it comes to driving from Maplewood to Cape Cod, or when it comes to driving um down to South Carolina, like what that felt like, what that was like. I don't know. Anyway, yes, I agree with you that there is absolutely an American tradition of this thing. It is just that like the fundamentals of it are so different because America is so much larger than Japan. They're like, I mean, like for instance, if I were to have kids now, what would my kids think of, right? We're growing up in Los Angeles, but all my family lives on the East Coast, right? Like we're gonna get into a plane and we're gonna fly to New Jersey, and it's gonna be a completely different experience for them because they live in this place that is surrounded by mountains, right? Mountains on the west coast are so huge compared to mountains on the east coast. And I just like I think about that stuff a lot, I guess.
Yeah, no, I mean, plus, there's differences in what that tradition might look like, right? Like I had coworkers at one point who grew up in like San Diego, and their childhood summer stories were about like going down to Tijuana and getting up to no good, right, and coming home, right? Like, and that's obviously a slightly different thing than a family vacation, but like that's like part of their like summer experience, right? Like,
Sure.
um,
Yeah, I
but
mean, even just the beach itself is something that's so different. Like when I think of the beach, I think of the Atlantic Ocean, obviously, which is very warm water. People going, you're playing in the water. Whether that's in, where my grandparents lived in Florida, where my cousins lived in South Carolina, where I lived in New Jersey, or where my other cousins lived in Cape Cod. You can swim in all of those waters because the Atlantic Ocean is very warm on the east coast of the United States. In California, the Pacific Ocean is very cold, right? So going to the beach is not about those things, right? And like the idea that you go to the beach so that you can, spend all day basking in like warm water, it's like that's completely alien to people in California compared to people in New Jersey.
yeah, I would dispute that the water's always warm on the East Coast, especially different parts of the year. But like, I think part of the difference there too is something that I recognize. When I lived on the um, West Coast, is that like a lot of the beach parts that are beaches are fairly industrialized, right? Like you go out on the Los Angeles beach and you can see like the ports, right? And the parts that aren't tend to be pretty rocky. Like I drove a significant portion of the one at various times, and so like, you can't really go on the beach there. Whereas like
Yep.
almost all of the East Coast is like, for lack of a better term, like tourist beach, right? Like the ports are all kind of like, like the big ports on the East Coast are like New York, and there's like no beach on like the New York part of New York for most of it, right? Like you go down to we have a word for them. They're called bennies, right? Like who leave the city to go to like the beach part of the beach. Um, Versus like in Los Angeles or in like San Francisco where I lived, you could like hop out onto the beach, but it was kind of like the nearby ones were like kind of ugly and kind of dumb, and also like you could see like giant ships spewing smoke like from where you were sitting on the beach. You can't really do that on like kind of
Yeah,
the
part of that is because it's true. Like most of it, when you do that drive up the one, which is fucking amazing and very cool,
yeah,
right?
beautiful. Highly
Uh,
recommend it.
yeah, the you are almost always like if you're driving north to your left, you are several hundred feet in the air, and there is raw cliff face down to rocks, right? So much so that like the history of California is sort of defined by this, right? Where you know, you can if you stop along the way, you can see like little like plaques that are put up as history, it's like, history markers or whatever that will talk about how um one of the things that happened in the late 19th century, early 20th century in California was you would have ships that would be out on the coast, right? Where they could actually kind of like drop anchor and sort of exist without getting, crashed to pieces on these rocks. Then you'd have people rowed ashore in these like, big rowboats essentially, climb the cliffs, cut down trees, essentially throw the trees into these huge chutes that could then be loaded back onto those boats, back out to the ships themselves, right? In order to transport lumber around the world, and it's just like that is like a completely different sort of topography to be dealing with compared to sort of the history of the East Coast. First of all, the history of the East Coast is so much more defined by like the Revolutionary War, right? It
Right.
seems like every town has the historical house from the 1700s as George Washington stayed in this house when the Battle of you know Pawtucket happened, and it's just like the fuck. Who cares? Like nobody. What is the Battle of Pawtucket? Who knows, right? You know, like that kind of stuff. And it just permeates everything that is happening on that side of the country.
Yeah, I'm thinking not only that, but like the East Coast got inhabited before like industry really like took over and got running, right? So like there's like less opportunity, like people like had staked claims to the beach, and it was harder to like kind of like have industry happen out there. But that's more like historiography than anything else. Um, but yeah, so 15 minutes into this section, I don't think I've actually asked the question. How was your week?
I guess my week was pretty good. Well, I'm thinking about this a little bit too, also because we drove to here's the big thing that happened. I drove to Las Vegas over the weekend because we got tickets from Rachel's dad to go see Roger Waters. Do you know who that is offhand?
No,
He's the Pink Floyd. He's like the Pink Floyd guy. Is the and I think I'm a little surprised that
that's a
he is
band,
going.
right?
Yeah, like you, obviously
I
you
know,
know
I know
Pink
who Pink
Floyd.
Floyd is. I'm just
Yeah, okay, yeah. It is weird to me that the show was mostly Pink Floyd music, half Pink Floyd music, um, and that it was not called Pink Floyd. But whatever. This dude is 79 years old, okay, and he is rocking so fucking hard. I could not believe my eyes, right? Literally the best concert I've ever been to, which is like weird to say in and of itself because like I've been to some really high energy, awesome concerts or whatever. Um, but Pink Floyd itself is just a band that I connected with really hard. They say that your brain is in such a state when you're a teenager that you are imprinting upon yourself things that will define the rest of your life, and one of those things is music, right? So, for instance, one of the things that has been demonstrated about Alzheimer's patients is that Alzheimer's patients will have memory like have memory issues about all these other sorts of things, but if you play them a song that they knew from when they were like 14 years old, they will be able to sing along to it. They will remember those lyrics, right? And it's just because like the power of music etching into your memory at that age is so insanely strong. And that's definitely true for me with Pink Floyd, right? Like I discovered Pink Floyd um, when I was in high school. I went through a huge Pink Floyd phase where I was listening to The Wall and Dark Side of the Moon, Shine On You Crazy Diamond, right? Like all that stuff. Wish You Were Here, I guess is the name of the album. But Shine On You Crazy Diamond is my favorite song from that album. And it was great to see that stuff, like it was great to see that stuff performed live. I think partially because those songs are easier and less complex. I've been to a lot of metal concerts where I actually am a little pissed because the concerts themselves are not great. It feels like the music itself is not being played very well. And I think part of that is because metal is a more technically intricate version of music that is more complicated to execute on than, prog rock essentially. I don't know. Maybe people would be really mad about that. Argue
I
with me in the comments if you think that
I
prog rock is harder to do than death metal.
I think that depends on the individual artist, right? Like I went and saw Sabaton live in concert, and they were fucking great. And I don't think their music's particularly complex, right? It's just like songs about like going to war, right? Like,
Yeah,
um,
sure. I just mean the act of playing the guitar or like doing that stuff on drums. It is probably harder to play a Sabaton drum line than it is to play a Pink Floyd drum line. I'm assuming. Who knows? Anyway, the it was great, and they played all the hits, right? But also it was political as fuck. The thing I said, I was like, wow, Antifa Grandpa really knows how to sing me some great songs, right? Because like Roger Waters has a lot of thoughts politically, and he wants you to know them. Even thoughts that would go so far as to say that like I would vehemently disagree with them in the instance that I was having a political debate with Roger Waters. But it was pretty fucking funny to see someone who I guess he could just do whatever he wants because he's the front man to Pink Floyd and wrote all of this insanely influential music in the 60s and 70s that everybody knows, and he's going to fill up that fucking stadium no matter what. So, you know what? When Antifa Grandpa says that he wants to make a whole diatribe about like the standoff at Standing Rock in North Dakota about that pipeline that has not been an issue for like 6 years or whatever, that like nobody has paid attention to except for him, but he really wants you to know about it. It's just like, okay, well, you know what? I really love Wish You Were Here, so I guess I'll just close my eyes for like the big portion of that's happening on screen or whatever. Anyway,
So
it
see,
was great. It was fantastic. I loved every second of it.
it's really interesting to hear that because like the best concert I've ever been to is I saw Bruce Springsteen live at the Meadowlands. As like I'm a born and bred Jersey boy, right? Like,
Sure.
also older, not quite as old as Roger Waters. He's 73. I looked it up while we were talking, but he played for like he didn't have an opener and he played for like 4 hours straight and he was just fucking going for it, right? Like
That
some,
was the same thing. He didn't
yeah,
have an opener. He played
yeah,
hard.
right, yeah. I mean, both artists have been around for a long time. Both can still go hard. Um, but it's interesting because like my parents are big Springsteen fans, but they used to complain, like before I was old enough they'd consider taking us to the concerts, that he would do this political diatribe thing in the middle of it, and they didn't really like it. They wanted to hear the music, they didn't want to go to hear his political opinions. Probably hurt by the fact that I think they disagreed with him on a lot of things. But when I saw it, he didn't do that at all, and I wonder if that's kind of like he didn't he if he you know I'm pretty sure he could fill stadiums for as long as he wanted to, but maybe he decided like that wasn't like the look he wanted to go for anymore. I mean, obviously, like he had that podcast. I don't know if he still does with former President Obama, which obviously there's like obviously there's a political lens to that. But it's just interesting. Like a lot of musicians have like strong opinions, but like you know I've been to a number of Weird Al concerts, and I don't know what he thinks about anything, right? Like, I don't
That's
think.
true. Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is that Pink Floyd music is fundamentally
Oh yeah,
political on its base. Like, what? So, okay, without being controversial, right? Like one of the questions about politics when it comes to like war and like anti-war stuff is there's the question of World War II, right? So for instance, one of the problems with anti-war stances is it has a hard time dealing with Nazi Germany in traditional political rhetoric, whether you right or left, right? Like this is what happened.
yeah,
What like everyone thinks World War II was a good idea. America swooped in. We did the morally righteous thing. We saved everybody. It is good. No one is going to stake the position, no matter like who you are, Democrat, Republican, whatever. No one is going to stake the position that the U.S. entering World War II was a bad idea,
let
right?
me tell you, buddy. I know some people.
Well, no, but
But
this is my point. Except for fucking Roger Waters, buddy. Roger Waters is gonna tell you that the United Kingdom, that the Allies are fucking hypocrites because they stopped Nazi Germany and then they brought back fascist movements to like suppress black people or whatever. And I'm just sitting there like, holy fuck, like we are deep in it now, boys. Let's go. And it's just like that, like that is something that was baked into the show that I saw, 2 days ago, and it was also baked into The Wall, which released in like 1980, right? Like the part of the whole beginning of The Wall is like evoking Roger Waters like what it was like for his family. He wasn't old enough, right? What it was like for his family during the Blitz, right? And what it was like growing up without a dad because his father, who by the way was a pacifist and a conscientious objector to World War II, and eventually saw that fascism was such a threat that he would later go on to enlist and then died in battle 5 months later. And it's just like it's haunting how hard The Wall goes about how terrible World War II was for him personally, right? Like, it's obviously a very personal
you're
album
right.
slash movie. And at the very least, this dude is consistent because 40 fucking years later, he's making the exact same points, right? And to be fair, it's incredibly poignant. He did a new song called "The Bar," and he had this thing where he was talking about how, like one of the things that he hates about modern living. It's almost like he didn't quite go this far, but it was sort of like a damn kids and their phones these days. Is that there is no such thing as the bar anymore, right? It used to be this thing where after work you would go to the bar and you could meet anybody, you could talk with anybody, you could have conversations, you could build a sense of community, and this is a thing that has been lost. And technically speaking, he's not wrong, right? In a sociological perspective, this thing is called, I think they were called like third places, which is, the bar, the church,
The
right?
bowling
The
alley,
community.
famously Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone, right? Like,
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah,
That's the thing that he's like going off of
yeah,
essentially, right? Um, I and many others would make the argument that people have created virtual third spaces, right? Like, you and I might have created our third spaces in Discord with playing video games with our friends, for instance,
sure,
right?
yeah,
But like whatever the case may be, this was his song. It's called The Bar, and he has this whole extended piece of that song that is just dedicated to retelling the story. It's telling the story of his older brother kind of like dealing with the problems of essentially being the man in the house, right? And he ends this whole verse, right, this whole long verse, by saying, these were problems that I never had because I was it was I don't remember what the lyric was, but he was like, because I was only 5 years old when my dad, or 5 months old when my dad died, right? I don't even remember him in the first place. And it's just like, boy, that hits you like a ton of fucking bricks, let me tell you. But I think the thing about Roger Waters' politics that worked so well in this is that he never interrupted the music for it, which was
okay,
nice, right? Like, the thing was, it was a big, not like a Christian cross. It was just an actual cross. One of which was long ways, one of which was short ways, essentially. But no matter where you were looking at it, you were getting sort of a I have no I how the fuck do I explain this? You no matter which way you were looking at it, it sort of created this screen for you, right? And so it was doing stuff like, you know like playing the song Pigs, also a very consistently, you know fascist bashing song from the 70s. He was playing the song Pigs over footage of police, like brutality, essentially, right? So like any of the famous, like, brutal policing that has happened, that has created this crisis of, like how we're dealing with cops and the police or whatever, right? Like that stuff is playing. But look, if you're there for the song Pigs, you're at least listening to the song Pigs. It's not like there is no music going on. It's just that he is taking the song Pigs, which was about cops in the 80s or 70s. Now it's about cops in the 2020s, right? Like, so anyway, that was Roger Waters. He was great.
yeah, no.
That was nuts.
Again, just as the compliment, right? Like Pink, I do know Pink Floyd's a band, but I've never really like listened to any of their music, at least not in any concentrated way. Um, but like Bruce Springsteen has some of that, right? Like famously "Born in the USA" is like an anti-war song, but like "Tunnel of Love" is not like a lot of this stuff isn't. So it makes sense that kind of like he's a little bit more tempered than a firebrand like Mr. Waters.
Yeah,
Um,
that's true. Yeah, and there were some stuff that was like not explicitly political, which honestly was pretty sweet. Like the song "Wish You Were Here," right, which is about, you know, you could say it's romance. It's a ballad, right? Um, it's also just maybe about platonic friendship, right? That song was a dedication to one of his bandmates, right? The guy he started Pink Floyd with. Um, and it's just like, yeah, that guy's he's dead, and he misses his best friend that he like started his, that he started his band with, and the stuff that they did together. And there's obviously like no political angle to something kind of along those lines. And even something like "Shine On You Crazy Diamond," which is sweet, and the guy with the best job was the saxophone guy, because he pops out once every 4 songs, rips a super killer sax solo, and then fucking leaves. Like it's just like, that's a song that is effectively apolitical. It basically doesn't have any lyrics. And what the fuck does "Shine On You Crazy Diamond" even mean in the first place, right? So, I don't know. If you are a conservative person and you are wondering if this thing is just like wall to wall Antifa propaganda, it's not.
yeah, no.
uh, so
Again, a parallel I want to draw to Bruce Springsteen. If anyone at home is familiar with 10th Avenue Freeze Out. It's basically a song about the formation of the E Street Band, which is Bruce Springsteen's band. And there's a part where he says, and the big man joins the band, who's Clarence Clemens, who had passed away at the, he still passed away, obviously, but he had relatively recently passed away at the time that I saw them play. And he just pauses the song, and like I guarantee you, there wasn't a dry eye in the audience, right? Like that kind of thing, right? Like, but yes, sorry, I just wanted to put that in there because you reminded me of it. But yeah, so it sounds like you had an exciting. Did you do anything else in Vegas?
Not all that much. I mean, I did not engage in any machine gambling, though I has completely rewritten the way, I went to Vegas a couple of years ago before I had read that book, and I didn't even think about, like I didn't think about this, right? You just kind of like walking up by. But it was sort of interesting and nuts, going after I have read the book about machine gambling, like walking through the floor of a casino. I don't think I saw anybody who's addicted to machine gambling, though. One of the things that the book talks about is that, someone who is addicted to machine gambling is mostly looking for sort of a private place where they don't have to feel, like going to a big public casino, right? Like we stayed in the Excalibur because it was right next to the arena. Um, going to the um going to the arena, or I'm sorry, going to the casino floor and seeing people sitting on, like these slot machines or whatever, right? Like, someone who is an addict doesn't want to be there. They're going to feel judged, right? They're going to feel shame being in a big open public spot with it. But when we went to a 7-Eleven, and in the back of the 7-Eleven there's this walled off section of it, right, with little cubicles that you really can't see into, that's where you would expect to find someone who is a machine gambling addict, right? Because they can be truly private and alone with their addiction there, which I think is interesting. So anyway, yeah, that's 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 what I did in Vegas.
Fair enough. Fair enough. The only really big thing I did with my week that isn't a repeat of previous weeks is I built
Boy.
a hitbox. I built a prototype of a hitbox. It's this crappy little thing in a Tupperware box, as part of the learnings. And this works, right? Like this is super easy. It wasn't super expensive. The things bouncing around in there are spare parts, not anything super critical. But it is literally just this. Yeah, let me see if I can put it up there. This board. This board only works with PC. You have to pay like 2 or 3 times more if you want a board that works with the console. But you just hook the buttons up with like some basic jumper cables. I highly recommend focusattack.com if you're gonna do this. Like part of the reason I did this is the hitboxes are always sold out. Like always sold out. And it's not that hard to make one, right? Like this thing requires some work, right? The buttons aren't positioned right. Like this top is not stable enough that like I can't really do like the slide thing that's supposed to make this easy. But this works, and I can play Strive with it if I want to. And I'm gonna my project is I've got hold on. I've got this briefcase, this like crappy briefcase. I'm gonna try and build like a better one in here. And then eventually my hope is that I'll take the parts for this one because they're slightly different than the parts I'm going to use for that one. I'm going to try and make an ergonomic split box for fighting games because I feel like that's like I'll talk about this next week, but I've got a fancy new ergonomic keyboard, right? Like why shouldn't I have that for something like this too, right? Like this is essentially the hitbox layout. I discovered by accident that there's a reason that like hitboxes are all cramped, and that's because like it lets you like use your right hand to hit the up button if you need to. But like, this is like a very cramped thing to do, and probably like apparently hitboxes are popular with people who've like hurt their wrists using joysticks. And I think you could just take that up, like if I could take this, split it in half, and pull it apart, then it would be even better. So that's a project for the future, but it is super fun to put together. I highly recommend that if you're interested in a leverless, or even if you want to build your own stick, this isn't hard, right? Like you probably want a better case than this piece of crap that I got, but you can find those places, right? Like maybe find like an old stick somewhere and replace the parts. But this is not hard to do. It's like an afternoon of like pushing wires together and between the buttons and like the cabling, it probably cost me like $125-$150, which is not nothing, but it's a lot cheaper than like a new hitbox is like $225. So, um, yeah, use that extra budget to get yourself a better case than this.
Hmm. Okay.
But yeah, focusattack.com if you guys are interested in buying your own parts. Um, yeah, but that was basically my week. Otherwise, I played a bunch of what's it called? Uh, Rumbleverse. That's what it's called. I played some Rumbleverse. I played some Crusader Kings. Um, yeah, that's basically most of it. I dove a little bit into Absolute Tactics, which seems like a solid strategy game. Gotta say, I wasn't the biggest fan of the writing. Um,
Fair enough. Okay.
and there's like, it's interesting because like, there's little quality of life things, right? Like I had to exit out in the middle of a fight, and it restarted the fight for me. I don't know if that's supposed to happen or not.
Yeah, that is
Yeah,
the save point is the beginning of a fight. When you leave a fight, you keep your experience, but you like you can only save again once you have defeated the encounter.
yeah. Okay, that makes sense. Because I was like, there's some scripted events in the fights, but it's not like clear like where the edges of it are. So I managed to get myself killed in like the second, no, the third fight. The first one with like the big enemies, because I was like, oh, these people aren't moving. They'll just let me do whatever I want until I like free this third person. And then they started attacking me, like, oh no, and then I died. Um,
Oh, I know exactly what you're talking about. Actually, I do
yeah,
know because they spawn those extra guys in there, and if you like split your party up, they kind of overwhelm you.
yeah,
Lou says in the chat, not sure what mode you picked, but I recommend playing higher than normal mode. Normal is way easy.
yeah.
That's
No,
fair enough.
I started playing on hard based on your recommendation, Lou. So
Okay.
thank you.
I
Um,
also only play that game on or have only played that game on hard because I was the only person to test it on hard. So the fact that those did you get to a war level?
no, I played the first three missions, then I went back and did the optional versions of the first two.
Oh, okay, cool. Did you find the secrets in those two?
No, yeah. Well, the first one they point you to it, and the
Yeah,
second
yeah.
one was pretty obvious. Yeah,
That's one of my favorite. Like I really like those optional missions and just kind of like in a way, I don't think I actually want this, but it's sort of like when a game like this has a story that you need to complete, right? It's always sort of weird to sort of putter around, but I like puttering around when it comes to these sorts of tactics games, which by the way is the difference between hard and full goth mode. Lou is talking in the chat. I don't know if you have played full goth mode, but the thing that happens in full goth mode is a unkillable like Grim Reaper spawns, and you can see where he spawns in the map. There's like a little tombstone somewhere in the map. An unkillable Grim Reaper spawns like 5 or 6 turns in, and he just starts hunting your guys down, and you cannot kill him. He just kicks the shit out of you. The only thing you can do is CC him, right? Which is insanely cool and fun, but also like it means that for someone like me who will spend literal turns just like rearranging the order of my guys before I sort of like run into the next section, it's like hell on earth, right? Because you no longer have the benefit of having 20 turns to sort of sort through this shit, right?
yeah. Yeah. The other thing I didn't like is that like, and this is a tradition in tactics games, so I'm not blaming this at Absolute Tactics V, but like when there's a chest on the map and you can't hit it after you've won the games, you have to keep like dragging like a weak enemy around so you can like hit all the boxes. It's like a thing that just like annoys me.
Yeah, it's slow play punishment. I hate it. Yep, that is absolutely true. That's a real thing. So
Oh man, I have been watching a bunch of like Magic the Gathering YouTube videos. I'm doing a sealed tournament with some coworkers over the course of the next few weeks. Um, but like, have you heard about? There's this setup where basically you might win the game, and like theoretically you could if you did it an infinite number of times. But like, essentially, it comes down to a coin flip, and like sometimes the coin flip will make your opponent stronger, but the other one half will make them weaker. And so like theoretically, if you did enough times, you'd be able to like it's non-deterministic. So like theoretically, like if you did enough times, you'd win. But like it's you can't name the number of times, um, because like it's theoretically infinite. And so like there's like a ruling around that's like it's slow play and like how many times you should be able to attempt it because it's like I said, it's like a coin flip. But once you get past like 7, you're almost certainly going to lose, and the chances of you ever winning go down astronomically. I'll find the video and I'll link it. But like it's interesting dumb stuff like that. Also, there's this it's the YouTuber's called Magic the Noah, and he's got a bunch of videos. That's like, this is a deck that will make no one like you. It's based around land destruction. You should never play this deck. Here's a deck list. Or like this deck is 97 swamps. This is your game plan. You basically draw a bunch of these swamps and then use a card that like you discard cards to like discard cards to deal damage, and that's how you win. And this is a dumb deck, and it costs $230. So you shouldn't play it, but it's a 97 swamp commander deck. Go for it.
Interesting. Yeah, the one that I pay attention to is Pretty Deep by John Kapora, which is hosted on the TCG Player, um, the TCG Player subreddit, which is mostly just that John himself is a very active speaker. Like when I am making like stuff for my job, I want to emulate the way that he talks because he just has a very engaging way of actually breaking some of this stuff down. And I don't know, I always want to emulate that as much as possible. But I do not pay a ton of attention. Magic moves too fast for me these days. They went from 3 sets a year to 4 sets a year, and that has broken my ability to comprehend and keep up with Magic. I'm officially a boomer. There's too many Magic cards coming out. 1,000 cards a year is way too much, especially now that so many of them are built specifically for Commander. I don't know. I think I would maybe go on a rant and say that they're ruining the game, but I also don't want to
I
actually
no,
make
I
that
mean
decision.
Wizards ruin commander sounds very boomery, but like they kind of did in the sense that like commander is a serious format now, and it was never supposed to be, right? Like the community tries to keep coming up with ways to make Magic not super competitive, and then then it'll get popular, and then Wizards will officially incorporate it, and then it'll become like I mean, and I think that like you even got there with like Commander before it got officially incorporated, like when it was still like what Elder Dragon Highborn, right? Like your Commander deck is not like relying on any Commander specific cards, right? And that's like a pretty oppressive deck as it stands, right? There's just like enough cards that exist to like make it work. Um,
Yeah, I mean, I think I liked Commander before Commander became Commander, because part of the fun of that was sort of the discovery, right? Like talking
yeah,
about fun as discovery, just like pulling out interesting cards from weird. Like my very first Commander was Rexiel the Risen Deep, and it was literally I used him just fucking because I wanted a blue black commander, and there just like weren't a lot of blue black legends. And like he's kind of doing stuff, but really at the end of the day, that was just like a blue black control deck. I never fucking won a single game of commander on that deck. It's not true. I won a couple, but it's just like it's exceedingly rare that I would ever win
yeah.
like a game of commander on that deck. And then commander sets started coming out, and I got back into it. Obviously, this was like I talked about this on the podcast, 2017, 2018, that kind of era of commander. That was when a new commander set came out once a year, basically. And you would have one, big drop of new commander cards every single year. And that's what sort of commander players kind of had to look forward to. And that was like a little much, but I would ultimately say it's cool, it's fine. The thing that changed is they went from producing precons for non-commander formats, basically, right? Like every new set included a set of pre-constructed decks for non-commander, like for non-commander formats. To making their precons commander format, which means that you are now getting an influx of commander cards every 3 months. And it's just like, who can keep up with that, right? At a certain point, also, like, the thing about commander is that the Highlander aspect of the games means that you can't build for consistency, right? But if you print 1,000 cards a year, right? baseline, you're now getting into situations where you're going to have multiple cards that can kind of execute on the same sort of thing, right? Well, not only are they printing 1,000 cards a year, but half of those cards are geared specifically to Commander at that point, right? It's just like I don't think Commander can survive in that format. Commander is now a turn 5 win sort of format, and like that's why I stopped playing regular Magic because it was getting too consistent.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I can't actually stake that position. I haven't played Commander in a long time just because I got so turned off by this stuff. Maybe it is better than I'm saying, but buh,
No,
boy,
I
do I
mean
miss
the
Legends.
the problem I think is that a lot of these formats are kind of like self-policed, right? Like, you show up at the table and you agree to like not play like your turn 4 decks, right? Like, but like even that's hard because it's like, well, I brought this deck and it was good, it's effective, but is it too good for like the spirit of Commander or whatever? It's just like,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah, I mean, there's all this stuff in Commander about rating your power level. Oh, my deck is a 7. My deck is a 10. My deck is a 5 or whatever. And it's just like, first of all, everybody always fucking says their deck is a 7 because nobody ever wants to say that their deck is a 9, right? And second of all, it's just how how much do I need to jump through these fucking hoops to just have a
yeah,
fun game of Magic?
yeah. No, I mean, yeah. This is like the culmination of what we've talked about. Is like people say they want close matches, but they want matches that they win, right? Like
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
Commander,
yeah.
right? Like people say they
Yep.
want fun matches, or they want like good competitive fun matches, but what they really want is they want to stomp their dumb friend to the ground with the perfect deck, right? Like,
Yeah.
um,
They want their friends to agree to play against them and put up enough of a challenge that it is not just like taking candy from a baby, and then they just like want to absolutely fucking dumpster
oh,
the
no,
table.
it probably depends on the player. It's like the Johnny wants your opponents to play and not touch you until you can pull off your perfect like fancy land combo and win
No,
everything
oh
because
my
you're
god,
so
yeah,
clever.
that is the thing that is real in Commander. People talk about the engine. Your deck has to have an engine, Mango. You have to have an engine, and you have to have tutors in order to find the pieces of your engine. And Commander is fun when you assemble your engine and it goes off. It's just like, no, fuck this. This is not what I'm here for. I
Yeah.
am here on turn 9 hard cast my 8 mana commander and then have to wait a full rotation of the table in order to swing with him once for a piddly effect. That's the commander that I want, Mango, right? Like, uh,
This makes me want to run that like this is like everyone will hate you deck that Magic to Noah put up because it's just like 4 to 8 different types of like land destruction. It's like that's the whole game is destroy lands and make everybody hate you. Also, we've got some
yeah.
counter spells and some tap effects, right? Like, um, which is probably the worst thing in the world, but it sounds like fun. Or it's like pure Dave is like you know the way to make everybody hate you. But yes,
Yeah.
that's Magic. We're like way over time. We're like 20 minutes over time at this point. So
Yeah.
um, if you want to email us what you think about Commander or holistic games or whatever else the fuck we talk, Japanese summers or American summers, email us at somederpsplaygames@gmail.com or podcast@somederpsplaygames.com. You can follow us twitch.tv/some Derps Play Games, where these go out live. We've got a YouTube. We've got a Patreon. We've got all those great things. Rate and review us. That's everything I have. But you have anything else you want to promote?
I have nothing else I am looking to promote.
All right. Well, in that case, I'm going to say until next time, dear listeners.
Until next time, loyal listeners.